Hello everyone. Today I'll be reviewing a book by Fyodor Dostoevsky called The Idiot. To make things interesting, I'd like to bring out Zizek's observation on Dostoevsky's statement from his movie called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology.
Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous statement from Brothers Karamazov, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Well, the first problem with this statement is that Dostoevsky, of course, never made it. The first one who used this phrase as allegedly made by Dostoevsky was Jean-Paul Sartre in 1943.
Zizek continues to call Dostoevsky's statement as false, reducing the novel to a form of apology for religious fanatism, which supports the necessity for godhood to maintain status quo or provide an excuse to terrorize people in the name of God. He stated that Sartre wrote the popular quote first, but it was in fact Sartre himself who spoke in his 1946 lecture titled Existentialism is Humanism. Sartre stated as follows, quote, Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted, and that for existentialism is the starting point. End quote. Sartre praised Dostoevsky for dramatizing existentialism and setting the base for existentialist discourses, while Zizek criticized it for its inaccurate citation and the irony of its statement in the face of religious fanatism. But Dostoevsky did observe religious fanatism. He wrote in The Idiot, page 247, quote, one man doesn't believe in God at all, while the other believes in him so thoroughly that he prays as he murders men, end quote. This accords perfectly well with the statement Zizek proposed. Perhaps Dostoevsky phrased it even better, while juggling 25 individual characters in his 650-page novel. Perhaps novelists are often subject to these treatments. Their works do provide playgrounds to philosophize or to provide entertaining and creative examples to state their ideas. Now back with the book. The copy I'm using is a Bantam Classics version, translated by Constance Garnett in 1913. It was originally published in 1869, which was serialized in chapters on the journal The Russian Messenger from 1868 to 1869. It is his eighth novel written after his famed books like Crime and Punishment and Notes from the Underground Man. Unlike his other novels, it is not as bleak and hopeless as it is full of humorous scenes and funny descriptions, often ascribing to the formulas of the fool character like Cervantes' infamous Don Quixote. The work is often described as fantastical by critics due to dramatization of ridiculous situations, overtly sympathetic characters, and melodramatic scenes that swoons away from the realistic tradition Dostoevsky hails from. But as Joseph Frank stated, that the idiot, quote, triumphed so effortlessly over the inconsistencies and awkwardness of his structure, end quote. Martin Scorsese even termed it as his favorite Dostoevsky novel.
The Idiot is my favorite, and Karamazov.
In this review, first I will give a brief synopsis of the work, focusing centrally on the main character, and after that its autobiographical subtext. After that, we'll move to the famous quotations from the book along with a wide selection of my favorite scenes in the novel that I personally cherished. So let's begin with a brief synopsis. The novel opens with a pale young man, dressed in thin clothes unfit for the harsh Russian snow, with no plans, with no money. All what he has, he bundled it up in a sack of white cloth. He is an orphan, taken up under the care of a Swiss doctor. He suffers from a chronic disease they call St. Victor's dance during their times, or in other words, epilepsy. And with his white gunny sack shivering under the cold, he heads towards St. Petersburg in search for his distant family. He is the last of his kind in royalty. His name is Prince Leov Nikolaevich Mishkin. His unusual behavior, carefree and childish innocence won the hearts of all the people he met on his way. He bears no grudges to cruel jokes made against him, or even absurd rumors ridiculed against him. He bores no romantic love and loves everyone in any ways he can. He gains respect for his honest stupidity. He believes everything that he is told to be true. He relates news down to every minute detail. He never lies, and everyone grew to love him. They would spoil him as they would have to a child that is happily ignorant in the ways of the adult world. But this story is far from being a happy one. Afflicted by his nerves, his medical condition, and awkward habits, he makes reckless decisions, performs frivolous actions, orate idealistic speeches, partake in adventures, lavish balls and parties. He tangles himself in family politics. He ties himself in the mesh of the upper class society. Ultimately, he is chained by his bitter conscience of himself and his incessant love for people who are suffering. This burden led him to decline in mental, physical, and spiritual health, with no one to help him but himself. People call him idiot not because he is a fool, but because everywhere he goes, he gains their trust and companionship in unusual ways. He became everyone's favorite fool. No one can overcome the idiot's art of befriending people. The novel is full of wonderful stories, exploring the stories of multiple characters. Take, for example, the pathological liar, Ivolgin, and his tales of partaking in Napoleon conquest, or the poem of the poor knight, narrated by the haughty general's daughter, Aglaya. The trickster, Lebediev, his prophetic theologies and complex lies. The suicide-holic, Hippolyte, and his 32-paged suicide note. All these voices, the idiot doesn't judge or condemn. He believes the lies, he appreciates their arts, he engages in abstract conversations and Russian politics. He regards every discourse to be true. He takes every single word uttered to heart. He believes them all in good faith. He believes even the lies are sincere enough to be heard. Now for its autobiographical subtext. This novel is arguably one of the most personal of his works. It includes his personal experiences of escaping death against the firing troop in 1849 and his lifelong struggle with epilepsy. In Part 1, Chapter 2, page 23, it contains his critical aversion towards capital punishment, the injustice, the cruelty and suffering it imposes to the victims who are treated and butchered like animals. And I quote, "It is written, 'Thou shalt not kill.' So because he has killed, are we to kill him? No, that's impossible." End quote. What is inhumane to Dostoevsky is the systemic psychological torture in moments prior to executions. He writes, quote, "All that last hope, which makes dying 10 times as easy, is taken away for certain." End quote. What is more humane to him is a death that would be unforeseen, sudden, and quick. A striking resemblance in real life is a statement made by an inmate from Nevada named Scott Dozier, who is sentenced to death, but his verdict is delayed for nearly 10 years due to matters concerning the legality of the substance, fentanyl, for execution. He killed himself by hanging himself in his cell.
This should have been a straightforward legal action. We spent millions of dollars cramming the death penalty down my throat. We spent $1 million on the death chamber, and tens to hundreds of thousands avoiding using it and carrying out a lawful, though dubious sentence. And all to amount to extended and vastly unnecessary, cruel, and unusual circumstances and torture. You say you're gonna fucking kill someone, you should fucking kill him.
Dostoevsky also describes this premeditated death is what Christ experienced before his arrest. In page 24, Dostoevsky wrote, quote, "It was of this torture and this agony that Christ spoke true." End quote. In Part 1, Chapter 5, page 65, Mishkin describes an execution scene in France to one of the Empachin's daughters, instructing her to draw the face of a man who had lost all hope, but at that crucial moment his life sentence was lifted and he lives for another day. This is from his personal experience with the mock execution he survived in 1849, the Tsar having been known to play such pranks on his political offenders, after which Dostoevsky served 4 years in Siberian prison, which became his crucial turn as a novelist. His experiences in Siberia marred the rest of his fiction. He wrote the intricate minds of convicts and criminals, serial killers, murderers, thieves, liars, drunks, rowdy civil officers, gamblers, all the rejects and dark recesses of society. Writing 13 impressive novels and dozens of short stories and novellas, he is crowned to be one of the first existentialist and psychological novelists, delving deep into the depths of the human soul. Another biographical detail are the accounts of the symptoms of epilepsy, the euphoric sense of dissociation and impending powerlessness that envelops him. He writes in Part 2, Chapter 5, page 253. Quote, he remembered, among other things, that he always had 1 minute just before the epileptic fit, when suddenly, in the midst of sadness, spiritual darkness, and oppression, there seemed at moments a flash of light in his brain, and with extraordinary impetus, all his vital forces suddenly began working at their highest tension. End quote. Now let's talk about some memorable scenes from the book. We'll split this into 4 parts. The first one will be aphorisms, the second one will be the humorous parts, the third one will be about beliefs and religion, the fourth one will deal with the dramatic section. Now we'll start with the most popular lines from The Idiot that are heavily alluded and later attained the status of an aphorism, which we now in the modern world club them as quotes. The first one is, beauty will save the world. This is quite similar with Keats' poetry, which has these ambiguous lines as well. A thing of beauty is joy forever, or beauty is truth, and truth is beauty. To me, this gained popularity with Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Nobel lecture speech. He is the author of the Gulag Archipelago and the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970. The link is in the description. In The Idiot, it is actually phrased this way. In Part 3, Chapter 5, page 430, quote, is it true, Prince, that you said once, beauty would save the world? Gentlemen, he shouted loudly, addressing the whole company. The Prince asserts that beauty will save the world, but as I assert that the reason he has such playful ideas is that he is in love. I was certain of it when he came in just now. Don't blush, Prince. It makes me sorry for you. What sort of beauty will save the world? End quote. The narrator is Hippolyte, an 18-year-old student suffering from tuberculosis. There was no cure during then. With roughly 6 months to live, he becomes bitter and jealous to everyone around him. Strangely enough, there is not a single instance of Prince saying this statement to someone in isolation. We only hear it from Hippolyte's dialogue. This statement is heavily interpreted with biblical undertones by critics to mean the acts of Christ, the beauty of his birth, his life, and his sacrifice. However, the Prince also calls beauty a riddle. In page 85, quote, beauty is a riddle, end quote, thereby making beauty a subjective phenomenon, as the properties of a riddle seem to rely on the answers scripted by the riddler. This is how I seem to interpret it. It is open to conjecture, and I will attach one interesting article with regards to this topic. Compassion was the chief and perhaps only law of all human existence. This was written in page 259. The novel weaves a complicated plot around love, which I have formulated into a single phrase to sum it up. Love for one, love for none, and love for all. Love for one would be Rogozin's passion for money and women. Love for none would be Hippolyte's open disregard for life, and love for all is the ever-compassionate Prince that resembles the image of Christ himself. And like all Dostoevsky's novel, everyone is right in their own ways. On the book, Man Searching for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, he wrote in page 64, quote, Dostoevsky once said, there is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my suffering. But the actual lines from The Idiot in page 587 is, quote, no, because I am unworthy of my suffering, end quote. I'll leave the context to be discerned by the reader. As you can see, it bears the same problem Zizek pointed out, which is rewriting and quoting a text inconsistently. However, the dialogue sticks to this theme of questioning one's suffering. Hippolyte is bound to die soon, and wallows in his suffering. Seeing no virtue in life and in death, he often threatens to kill others in the process, while the Prince lends an ear, invites him to his home, and tried helping him bear his suffering in peace. As Mishkin replies through the suffering Hippolyte, if anyone is able to suffer more, he must be worthy of suffering. End quote. Now for the humorous parts, the fun lines. On page 43, a man was said to become a rich merchant, but he was met with a tragic fate. The way the information is related is where the humor lies. Quote, he had been 2 days in town when the elder of his little village rode in with his beard burnt off and his cheek scarred, and informed him that the place had been burned down the day before, just at midday, and, quote, that his lady had graciously been burned, but his children were unhurt. End quote. This surprise was too much even for Barashkov, accustomed as he was to buffeting of fortune. He went out of his mind and died in delirium a month later. End quote. Russian humor is full of dark humor. It disregards ethics, it lacks respect for the dead, and masterfully executed to leave the readers with a funny, tragic comedy to think of. On page 121, it has some old-school slapstick comedy. Quote, without uttering a word, and with extraordinary courtesy, the most perfect, the most refined courtesy, I delicately picked up the lapdog by the collar in 2 fingers and flung it out the window after the cigar. It uttered one squeal. The train was still racing on. I'll leave the readers to discover its context. On page 425 to 426, I call this the Great Lebedev speech. This entire section is absurd comedy. Lebedev is trying to defend his client, who presumably is a cannibal, who, quote, changed his diet from the clergy to the laity, end quote, after having eaten 6 clergymen already. Lebedev dialogues are slippery, running between the lies and the truth, virtue and vice. I think he is the most complex character in the novel. On page 112, I call this the gullible prince, or is it gullible risk, because the prince has unusual ways of befriending people. Ganya and Varya are siblings who are quarreling. Meanwhile, Natasha gave them a surprise visit, and he mistook the prince for a footman. The prince is stunned with her beauty and complied to obey her call. He even failed to catch Natasha's quote twice. Mimicking the role of a footman, like the one he saw before in Empachin's home, he announced her name in a resounding tone, quote, Natasha Filiponova, end quote. Later on, Natasha laughed when she discovered the incident, but fell for his idiotic ruse. In page 618 to 619, I want to dub this as the Chekhovian vase. This is like a perfect comedy of situation. I laughed audibly after reading this section. Everything was foregrounded perfectly to set the domino effect in place, although to reveal it would spoil the punchline, so I would not say anything further. This leaves us with the third section, which is on belief and on religion. In page 616, Dostoevsky writes, quote, and Russians do not merely become atheists, but they invariably believe in atheism, as though it were a great new religion, without noticing that they are putting faith in negation. So great is our craving. End quote. It reflects on the nature of belief, how man cannot escape from belief. Man puts his faith in sciences, or in arts, or in religion. Even our language is structured on the belief of the possibility in communication. In page 245, Rogozin asks Prince Mishkin, quote, do you believe in God? End quote. The answer the prince gives is not a resounding yes or no, but he questions the basis of this interrogation by bringing 2 characters, the tale about a believer and a non-believer. I'll leave the readers to explore the context. Rogozin loved it, and concludes the tale by saying, quote, one man doesn't believe in God at all, while the other believes in him so thoroughly that he prays as he murders men. End quote. Even if the answer is a yes or no, it doesn't change the fact that you are a human being that can lie, that can steal, and that can kill regardless of his belief. In page 459, Dostoevsky reflects on mortality and materiality on the dead Christ. This can be clubbed under Christian existentialism. Hippolyte, on seeing Holbein's painting of the Christ, he writes, quote, I know that the Christian church laid it down, even in the early ages, that Christ's suffering was not only symbolic but actual, and that his body was therefore fully and completely subject to the laws of nature on the cross. End quote. This leaves us with the last section, the dramatic scenes. This is quite hard to explain. It must be read to see its stage, so I will illustrate the pages and be brief with the explanation. From page 435 to 467, we have the suicide notes. The suicide note has its title called Explanation, and with another title, Après moi deluge. This is a French phrase which translates to After us the flood. This was said by Louis XV, who was a French king during 18th century. It is a nihilistic expression which seems to say, and I quote, "When I am dead, the deluge," which means the flood, "may come, for aught I care." In page 282, we have the poem in the novel. This is a homage to Cervantes' character Don Quixote. The poem is described as the poor knight poem multiple times in the novel. In page 196, Lebedev explains the Japanese way of taking revenge, which I have speculated to be seppuku. Quote, "You have wronged me, and in revenge I've come to cut open my stomach before you." End quote. In page 424, we have discussions about cannibalism in the 12th century. Lastly, we have in page 640 the confession scene, the mental breakdown which follows, and the marriage. Along with this, the last section also contains a clever covert exposition, which has a reluctant narrator seemingly taking part in witnessing a secret event. All these scenes, I will not disclose the context, and I will leave readers to discover it for themselves. In this closing remark, I want to cover two things: the various translations that the book has, and people's impression on the book, on all of Dostoevsky's books, and YouTubers talking about it, critics talking about it, normal people talking about it. So let's start off with the translation. With regards to the translation, we have two famous translators, the Constance Garnett version and the P&V version. These are the two famous ones. We have the P&V version, which is hailed to be one of the best Russian translators from Russian to English, due to its extensive use of footnotes in the back, which cover each and every detail about the places, the times, the literary techniques that it's used, all sorts of details that other translations didn't cover. And the other version is the Constance Garnett version, which is one of the most popular versions because this was circulated heavily during the 20th century. It was heavily read by Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, and other readers and writers. So I think it's equally viable to read this book, the Constance Garnett version. And if we inquire what is the best translation, I don't think there is the best translation in any sorts of translations. Every translation is perfect in its own way. We have multiple versions of the Bible. It has its central message intact, and I think that is the most important thing. Although if you want the Russian-oriented literate translations, we can go for the P&V version, although the lay reader can read the Constance Garnett version equally well and be entertained by it. Secondly, I want to talk about people's impression in buying this book. People often buy this book because some YouTubers or some critics or some psychologists say all sorts of things with regards to the book, all sorts of interpretations, the psychological ones with its archetypal structures of personalities and pathologies, or the philosophical ones, existentialism, cynicism, nihilism. All sorts of interpretations are right in its own way. However, they often hinder one important crucial interpretation, that is the reader's own interpretation. If you are coming with the impression of gaining all sorts of psychological insight or philosophical insight from the book, I'm sure that you won't get much out of the book. You have to read it like you listen to music. You have to watch it like you watch art. What I'm trying to say is that the reader, you should make, or you should see your own way, not let other sorts of interpretations hinder your insights. For that, it is important to closely read the book, each of its page, each of its hard names to remember, each of its discussions that it has, each of its 32-page suicide novel, suicide letter that it poses, all these characters are equally interesting to listen, to watch, to discern, and I want the readers to focus on that instead of focusing on all of these isms and pathologies and psychological observations. You observe the book on your own. What I'm trying to get through is that the novel The Idiot is a work of an art by an artist. It is meant to be read wholly, not within its quotes and quotations and ideologies, and taking out the words, simply taking out the individual parts of the book. It is not meant to be read in that way. It is meant to be read wholly, and I want the readers to think of the book wholly as it is, not as taking out the individual parts. Although you can do that, however, it is important to experience first instead of discerning it. So I would invite the reader to be immensely immersed in the world of Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot. Thank you.